We are here in sunny Long Beach, California for IANA Intermodal Expo, one of the best intermodal conferences of the year at one of the busiest ports in North America. How's your experience been so far?
The experience so far has been absolutely wonderful.
What's your experience been like at Expo?
It's been incredible.
So we will see you here at Intermodal Expo 2023. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Thoughts and Coffee. That's right. It's another Tuesday morning. I am back from Philadelphia. My name is Sarah Barnes-Humphrey. I am the founder and host of Let's Talk Supply Chain, the founder and host of the Blended podcast, as well as the founder of the Blended Pledge. Now, I want to give a really big shout out to Eric and Ashley, who held down the fort for Thoughts and Coffee last week. Thank you guys so much. I heard that it was a great show. So really appreciate that. Home Delivery World was great. We recorded some exclusive content with some of the biggest retail names in supply chain at the conference exclusively for the Secret Society of Supply Chain. So if you have not joined the Secret Society of Supply Chain yet, or at least the wait list, because we haven't launched it, you haven't missed out yet, but we do have limited spots. Go and make sure that you sign up for it because we created some great content. I was on stage a couple of times. We created a couple of podcast episodes that are coming up. So had a really great time. And thanks to the folks at Home Delivery World for having me. Now let's talk about what's happening at Let's Talk Supply Chain. So we've got a brand new episode. Usually we do Women in Supply Chain episodes at the beginning of the month. And we did a special Juneteenth episode yesterday with Sharon Manker, and we are getting all sorts of amazing feedback on this. So if you haven't checked it out, go and check out her story, her journey in episode 344, wherever you listen to the podcast. And that means that we had 2 Women in Supply Chain episodes this month. So I'm really excited about that. Now, before I go any further, I probably should let you know about our show sponsor. So say you're at work and all the lights flicker and then go out. Well, you try to move and bump into something, you turn and bump into something else. You can't work like this. You need to be able to see what's happening. This is how your inventory feels. Fastenal has unique inventory solutions that sends data to the cloud and help you avoid stockouts while not carrying excess inventory. Don't stay in the dark. Let Fastenal shine a light on the parts and supplies that keep your business running. Go to fastenal.com/LTSC to see how they do it. All right. What else is happening at Let's Talk Supply Chain? Well, on June 28th, I'm going to be joining AT&T for a conversation about solving supply chain inefficiencies. I'm changing it up a little bit. I am not hosting or moderating this discussion. I'm actually going to be a guest for this as well. So go and check it out. We've put the link in the comments. Click the attend button. I'm sure you'll get the recording if you cannot attend live, but I'm really looking forward to this conversation with Tamara and Helen. Also, we've got the Woman in Supply Chain Awards with Supply and Demand Chain. Now, these are only open. The nominations are only open, I think, until July 14th. So if you have a woman in supply chain that you want to nominate for this particular award, head over to the link in the comments and nominate them. Get them noticed because we definitely also want to see them at the forum in November as well. What else is happening? Oh, we are hiring. We are looking for a TikTok content creator and ambassador. So if you want to join our team, if you are creative, if you want to be the face of the Let's Talk Supply Chain TikTok, now is your chance. Now we've put the link in the comments for this as well, and we want to hear from you. So go and apply and we will be in touch very soon. And last but not least, the Supply Chain Minute is back. Mike Bush is going to be joining joining us for the Supply Chain Minute. We just released the first episode last Thursday, The State of Drag. You don't want to miss this. These are like 1 to 2 minute snippets every single Thursday morning to update you on what is happening in supply chain and what you need to know. So definitely go and check that out. Now, without further ado, it is time for me to bring up our guest for today. Patrick, welcome to Thoughts and Coffee.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the invite, Sarah.
Yeah, it's a little early for you. So I just want to thank you for getting up for us and showing up for Thoughts and Coffee. Tell everybody who you are and what you do.
Well, I'm the founder of Trakking. It's an online platform that manages empty containers and sources empty containers across Canada.
Yeah, and we're going to be talking all about that because apparently empty containers are part of the supply chain disruption that we're actually not talking enough about. So I'm really excited that you're here because I think we're going to be sharing a lot of great insights and information that people really, really should know about. So before we get into your market update, we are actually going to be talking about the poll of the week. So what did we ask you last week? What is your ideal work environment? Well, 74% of you said, I like creating my schedule. 25% of you said, I prefer having a set routine. And only 1% of you said other and shared your opinion below. Now, Patrick, as a business owner, I know there's been a lot of discussions, amongst a lot of different organizations. Do we go fully remote? Do we do hybrid? Do we go back into the office? What has life been like for you and in the conversations with your teams?
Well, for our organization, a lot of the supply chain happens, online. And so whether you work from home or whether you work from office, it really doesn't matter. So I find that it really depends on the role, and I think that's probably what most leaders would agree on. If you're in the sales role, the last thing that you want is for them to be in the office. If you are driving a truck, of course, you've got to be in the truck, and you can't be working from home. So right. I do find that in supply chain, perhaps it's easier just because of the role that's defined. But definitely we support whether it's a hybrid or work from home or working in the office. So that's been our sort of motto at our company.
Yeah, I appreciate you for sharing that. So we have an episode of Blended coming out in August that I just recorded yesterday. And it's about anxiety. And we talked about, going back to work. We talked about the fully remote. And there's anxiety for both sides. A lot of people are experiencing anxiety thinking about going back into the office, that full time, 5 days a week. But then on the other side of the spectrum, fully remote, when you're not seeing your teams, you're not around people, you're not socializing, can get very lonely. And that causes a very different type of anxiety as well. And so what we talked about yesterday was how the hybrid model can actually help, mitigate sort of the anxiety on both sides of the spectrum and give people the options to come in and socialize, but then also create their own schedule, which I think, most people that's what they're looking for.
Well, I think, Sarah, the key is really knowing your employees and knowing sort of your business, right? Mm-hmm. And the key, of course, for the last while has been trying to attract the best talent for your organization. Yeah. And so for me, that's sort of, it goes with the territory and making sure that it's appropriate for the staff that you have.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of the people in the comments from our poll last week actually agree with us and say that, the hybrid model is really the best of both worlds and what people are really, really looking for. So I appreciate everybody who weighed in on that poll. We'll have another question for you tomorrow morning. Now, before we move on, I want to give a shout out to Sheik, Ganesh, and Donna over on my personal LinkedIn. Thanks for joining us today. And Donna is saying, I'm not seeing any links. I update my personal LinkedIn post after the show. So Donna, those links are coming, but if you want them right away, the links are on the Let's Talk Supply Chain LinkedIn page. All right. So Patrick, give us a bit of a market update. What are you hearing from your clients? What are they talking about? What are the most pressing issues for them right now? And what are you seeing in your part of the market at the moment?
Well, everybody probably knows that, it's a big relief last week in terms of the tentative agreement that was signed on the U.S. West Coast ports. So that was a big.
Tell us about that. So it was signed. We're good to go. There's no more potential
And sorry,
disruption.
I should probably specify. We're talking about in the U.S. here. Canada
Yeah.
on the West Coast, Vancouver and Prince Rupert, we're still sort of waiting, and we've got, I think, 2 more days, or actually 1 more day tomorrow. I think tomorrow's the last day in terms of the cooling off period. So I think everybody's crossing the fingers, and hopefully there's going to be some agreement to extend or to come to some terms in terms of both sides. So I think that's sort of in the minds of a lot of people right now in terms of what that's going to look like in terms of the West Coast here. I think that I think there was an announcement yesterday that Halifax Port, ILA, they had an agreement that was extended for, I think, 4 years or 5 years. So it's been a big relief on the East Coast.
Ooh.
So that's definitely one topic. It's been slow. I would say that most people know that the market's fairly slow in terms of where things are at. It was, I think U.S. had sent a ambassador to China, and they just finished a 2-day negotiation. So I think people are looking at that politically to see if there might be something that will happen between U.S. and China, and that will have an impact in terms of trade. So lots of things happening.
Yeah. And it sounds like, but I mean, there are some relief at the ports, which I think everybody has sort of been on pins and needles,
That's
especially
right.
when we're looking at bringing in cargo.
Yeah.
Which port do I go through? And now there's some relief to know that, obviously that agreement has been signed in a variety of different areas, not necessarily in BC just yet.
Yes.
But we're seeing some relief from a bit of a risk standpoint.
That's right.
Absolutely. Okay. So let's get to our first article of the day. So this article is from September 2022, and it's from the Maritime Executive, and they're talking about, and the reason why I went back to September 2022 is because I think that we can really see a change in what was predicted in this particular article by Sea Intelligence, and talk about what's kind of happened between September and June and where we are now, which is what we're going to talk about in the second article as well. So here in this particular article, they were talking about how ports are blaming empty containers for supply chain disruptions. Now, again, this was only about 6 to 8 months ago, and it wasn't something that we talked a lot about. So talk to us about how empty containers in 2022 were part of that disruption, but really didn't make the news.
Well, if you remember, the late 2022 in September was when things started to open up, Sarah, after the post-COVID. And, this was sort of probably the beginning where you started to seeing some instability on the ocean freight rates on the inbound side. And that's really a function, of course, demand from US and Canada. And so empty containers, started to pile up starting in September, October. We saw that a lot in terms of the ports. And I think there was a lot of, finger pointing in terms of, why the empty containers weren't being sent back to Asia. And, I think that overall, it's difficult to isolate one specific issue and say, well, it's because there's over empty containers. Well, the only reason why there's over empty containers is because there were a lot of laden containers that were brought into North America because of the demand.
Right.
But I think it highlights really one of the key things, which is how do you look at manage these ups and downs? And this is the problem, of course, that's happened throughout decades, simply because of the different needs across the country. Between the East and West. And so it's really not a new problem. I would say it probably got accentuated primarily because of the overall volumes. And so you saw a lot of that empty containers piling up on the East Coast.
Yeah, you mentioned pointing fingers and blaming. It takes me back to my freight forwarding days, like pre-pandemic, where finger pointing and blaming was kind of the thing. I'm
Right.
hoping that at this point we can get back to or get to collaboration and
That's right.
no more blame games. So when you said that, that's why I chuckled a little bit. But the other thing that they talked about in this article was that they're going to start charging fees, or they were thinking about charging those fees as of September, but those were going to move forward into 2023. Was that the answer? Did it work? Like, is that something that is going to stop empties being piled up?
Well, I think charging fees, can be one possible solution. Obviously, it's this disincentivizing in terms of um, BCOs and forwarders in terms of holding the empty containers.
Right.
But I think that it's really just a symptom of a more systemic problem,
Okay.
primarily in terms of where do you position empty containers in the right places?
Hmm.
How do you look at sort of having that infrastructure both on the land side as well as the rail? It's really not a simple solution. It's a short-term solution.
Yeah.
It's interesting to see how different countries respond to it, because Australia, I found out, they actually, coming from the government, they actually charge shipping companies fees for too many empty containers,
Huh.
sitting in the ports, and so they have a quota where they say, well, if you reach this number, then you're going to be charged. And so I think different countries, different organizations, they have their own strategy in terms of dealing with that.
Hmm.
But I do feel that there has to be a way in terms of solving the root of the problem,
Hmm.
which I feel has to do with really data sharing, understanding where empty containers are, understanding where they should be, and perhaps have dynamic pricing. It's no different than Uber or Lyft in terms of, hey, when there are peaks, perhaps there should be charges that's implemented in certain areas and then relief.
Mm.
They do that in Europe, Sarah, because when you return empty containers in certain deficit areas, it's free. When you return empty containers to surplus areas, they charge a fee.
Wow.
And so it does disincentivize in terms of where you position those empty containers.
And so how does tracking help with that? Talk to us about the platform, and does it do what you're talking about, or how does it help your customers? Now, I do want to let everybody know that Patrick was on the podcast talking about what tracking does, everything from who you are, what you do, how you help your customers. So go and check out that episode on letstalksupplychain.com to get more information. But really just high level for the audience right now, does tracking help with that, and how does it help?
I think what I said earlier, Sarah, is understanding where empty containers should be.
Mm-hmm.
It is part of the product, part of the solution. And what we've been doing on our platform is capturing some of that data.
Mm-hmm.
Because a lot of times empty containers that's being released or empty containers that's being returned here in Canada, a lot of that is still done manually via an email or a telephone call.
Right.
Well, you don't capture a lot of that information through a telephone call or email. And so what tracking does is automate that process, capture that data, and then begin to look at the analytics behind it,
Mm-hmm.
and then look at dynamic pricing in terms of facilitating where those empty containers should be.
Amazing. And like you said, I mean, it's got to be a collaborative effort. There's got to be some data sharing. You've got to be able to have the right data in order to be able to know where to send the container at what time, so you don't get a surcharge, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So super important. Now we have a question from the audience, which I think we'll get to in just a minute, but I want to get to our second article. So this comes from Tracking in particular. And what I like about your blog is that they are short, easily digestible updates on what's happening in the market. So we talked about what was happening in September 2022. What is happening right now? Because what I'm seeing from the article on your website is that drayage rates are higher than ocean rates. You've got a shortage of 20-foot containers right now. And we've got potentially a shortage of 40-foot containers coming up at the end of this month. How are we in shortages when we're in surplus of empties? Like, what happened?
It seems contradictory, right, Sarah?
Yeah.
Because on one side you've got too many containers, and then the other side you've got lack of. But I think the problem is still the same, Sarah. Which is where do you have the right container for the right customer at the right time?
Right.
And so, we're at the tail end of the agri season in terms of shipping 20s. And so 20-foot containers typically on the West Coast are used to ship, lentils, beans, grain, and canola. Well, right now, because of the lack of lack of containers coming in North America, you've got that empty. But also, going back to that article, there were too many empty containers sitting in Toronto, sitting in Montreal. And truckers were frustrated in terms of having those containers sitting on their chassis. And the rail, of course, was congested. And that, of course, augmented the problem. So you've got too many containers, again, on one side of the country. And then you've got a demand on the other side, and, they don't match. And so that, again, continues to be the systemic problem in terms of how do we look at positioning those right containers to the right customer at the right time.
So are the right discussions being had right now to find a solution for this particular challenge? Because again, I go back to my comment with the first article, is that empty containers are actually part of the supply chain disruption. And if we're talking about having a surplus of empties and a shortage of containers, we obviously haven't had the right discussions to solve this in the last 8 months, if that's what we're facing at the moment. So talk to us about that. And it talks also about in the second article about how returns are the answer to congestion, maybe. I don't know. Walk us through that.
Yeah, I would say that, now that things are not as hectic as it were, during the COVID, I think those discussions are being had. What we try to do, at least, through our platform, is provide an outlet for truckers that are holding on to containers that need to be returned to the right location. And so I think those, solutions are being provided. But I think there's still a lot of work to be done, Sarah. It's not an overnight, one-trick pony where you can solve that problem that's been, again, for decades. But I think it starts somewhere, and it starts with, providing immediate short-term solutions, but having those discussions in terms of how do you look at solving that in a long-term.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you, Berkeley. Berkeley just posted on my personal LinkedIn the link to the particular article that we're talking about. So I appreciate that. And thanks for joining us. Now, we have a question from the audience. It doesn't necessarily have to do with empties, but it kind of does, because you talk a lot at Trakking about sustainability. So what sustainability measures can be taken for transportation? Why don't we talk about it from an empty container perspective and how it can really significantly help with ESG initiatives and obviously, sustainability goals?
Yeah, Sarah, ESG and sustainability is definitely one of our passions, and that's one of our directives in terms of managing these empty containers. So imagine you've got a container that's supposedly, going to location A. Well, that's going to take up X amount of CO2. Well, it was supposed to be in location B, and then you've got that additional leg. And so we're constantly measuring how much CO2 is being saved when we have some of our solutions on our platform, whether it's street turn, reusing these containers, returning at the right location. And so all those things, I would say, have some impact in terms of sustainability and CO2 measurements.
Yeah, and I think you've got some amazing stats over on your website. So I highly recommend that you go to Trakking, that's TRAKKING.com, to check those out. Because again, everybody's looking at their sustainability initiatives. They're looking at their ESG goals. One area that they might not be looking at is with the empty containers, right? You offload a container, the empty is hopefully gone, or maybe it sits there for a little bit, but you don't really think about that leg of your supply chain.
There's 7 million containers that go through Canada every single year, Sarah.
Mhm.
Imagine every single container of that is being tracked in terms of the sustainability and in terms of where where it should be and where it's being returned back. I mean, that's amazing on an
That's a lot.
annualized
That
basis, right, Sarah?
Yeah. Yeah. Big numbers. All right. Let's get to our last article. Now, this is from CNBC, and it's talking about reglobalizing, which I thought was a really cool word here used by the WTO chief. So she's talking about how the supply chains cannot be reliant on a few countries for a few key products. Now, we've been talking about diversifying your supplier base, your manufacturer, where you're making your goods, where you're finding your raw materials. I mean, that was a lesson learned that came out of the pandemic. And so it's not really anything new, but she's talking about looking into the future, how governments can also take a look at diversifying their supplier base so that we aren't left with key products being made in places that could be a friend today, but might not be a friend tomorrow, which I thought was a very key phrase from this particular article as well. Patrick, what did you think reading this one?
I completely agree with the article, and it's not something that's really new to me. It's a philosophy that I've always embraced, as a business owner, as well as talking to customers. Over 70% of Canada's trade is still with the US. That's a huge number, right? And it's an easy trading partner, which is a great partner. But I think a lot of on the government side, as well as business leaders, recognize that they can't rely on one country or two countries. So recently in May, for example, Sarah, British Columbia announced that they're having a diversifying strategy in terms of trade. So they focused on three countries: Taiwan, Vietnam, and Mexico.
Okay.
And other provinces, including Ontario, are having those same discussions. That's going to be aligned with the feds as well. And so I think that our government is doing a lot in terms of looking at those opportunities and seeing if businesses can look at other countries in terms of their trade, whether it's on the import side or export side. So I think that's definitely the future, the forecast.
Yeah, I've heard of a lot of companies actually looking in Mexico. I had a conversation with a well-known retailer, and they manufacture a lot of goods in the Far East. And so we talked about, what does that look like for your supply chain? Are you looking to diversify? And because they're in fashion, she talked about how expertise is really important when they're thinking about manufacturing in a different location. And so their hands are a bit tied because the expertise outside of China is in Europe.
Yes.
And so when they can't necessarily just move to Mexico because the expertise in garments and things like that is not necessarily in Mexico just yet. But they're looking at places like Eastern Europe, because those are the alternatives that they have based on the needs that they have. So it's very different for every single organization.
That's right.
It's interesting that governments are looking at this and making sure that we are set up, obviously, for the future if something were to happen, making sure that we are looking at different places to be able to produce key products, key ingredients, key things that we need as Canadians or maybe Americans when something like this does hit. So she used the word globalize to build global resistance. She also used the words invest in own economic vibrance. I love all the words that was used by the WTO chief in this article. So go and check that out because I just loved all of that. Do you have anything else to add before we move on?
No, I think you're right, Sarah. I mean, it's got to be company specific. And, I think that if for those companies that don't know, the Canadian government does a great job in terms of supplementing and aiding and helping companies looking at those markets. And so if you don't know, I mean, check out sort of the trade consulates. There's so much information on there.
Yeah, so much great information. I'm glad that you mentioned that. All right. So before we go, I just want to let you know where we are going to be. So Hope White is going to be live on Friday. Now it's a surprise because we don't have any of her details just yet, but you're going to have to tune in to find out what she's talking about and who her guest is Friday at 10 a.m. Eastern across Let's Talk Supply Chain. Of course, I'm going to be on the AT&T LinkedIn Live June 28th. I'm going to be at the Women in Supply Chain Forum with Supply and Demand Chain because we are a presenting sponsor. That is in November in Atlanta. And that's about it for us. So, Patrick, thank you so much for coming on Thoughts and Coffee and sharing with us, what's going on with empty containers, how we should be thinking about that in our supply chain. So many great insights. And thank you all in the audience for joining us as well. I'm going to head over to my personal LinkedIn and update those links soon so you can go check everything out. Thanks again, Patrick.
Thanks, Sarah.